Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Dami Adewale.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be talking about zakat, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, which is often fulfilled during the holy month of Ramadan. Now, last April, a study by the consultancy Blue State found that British Muslims give at least 4 times the national average to charitable causes. The report also found that Muslim respondents were more involved with volunteering, community organisations and fundraising events. So using those findings as a starting point, we'd like to ask what the rest of the charitable sector can learn from this trend amongst one of the country's major, but also most economically disadvantaged demographic groups, as well as to understand how the process of giving and receiving zakat works in practice.
We have 2 guests joining us for this discussion. With us in the studio is Sohail Hanif, Chief Executive of the National Zakat Foundation, a charity that links givers and recipients of zakat. Hi, Sohail.
Hi.
Also with us is Taqwa Sadiq, a freelance audio producer who won a slew of awards for a brilliant podcast series she produced and presented for BBC Sounds last year. It's called Sacred Money, and it explores through quite a personal journey whether the spiritual and religious tradition of zakat can help solve the cost of living crisis in the UK. Hi, Taqwa.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. So first things first, could you please fill us in on the basics of zakat for somebody who doesn't know anything about it? What is it and how does it work?
Yeah, so it's kind of a bit of a tricky one in the sense that the more you look into it, the more confused you get. Is it a spiritual ritual? Is it a long-standing tradition? Is it sort of like something which has lots of parallels in modern ways of thinking about charity? Is it an economic function? What is it? And I think it's easier to understand that kind of theory after thinking about the practical steps of how it's actually done. So in its most rudimentary basic form, zakat is the idea that if you have a certain amount of wealth for a full calendar year, then you owe 2.5% of your savings to people who don't have that same amount. So that amount changes depending upon the value of gold or silver, but we're looking at roughly between £300 and £400. And the idea is that if you've got that much to your name for a whole year, then you're sort of doing all right. And if you don't have that, then you kind of fall under the category of somebody who is in need of support from people in their local community. And the idea is that to close wealth gaps within neighborhoods between people who live side by side, 2.5% flows from one side of that threshold to the other side. And I think that's essentially the most basic way of explaining it. I'm sure that there are other bits that I'm leaving out, but for now I'd say that's kind of the general idea.
Do recipients of zakat need to be Muslim?
I think there's lots of conversation around that, and there are multiple categories of eligible zakat receivers. And what I found throughout making the podcast that you mentioned is that there are some charities who have found it fairly straightforward to sort of expand that into the non-Muslim space as well. I visited a food bank in Hounslow run by the charity called Muslim Hands, and they operate on this really fascinating policy of no questions asked. So it doesn't matter who walks in. They call it the open kitchen. Anybody can rock up sort of in the flashiest car possible wearing designer clothes. And if they walk in and say, I need some hot food, they give it to them. And I think they're trying to move away from that kind of means-tested approach to giving. And they found it fits quite neatly into the categories of zakat recipients. So people have different ways of approaching it, and I think you can be really creative about it.
Sohail, just building on the discussion that we've just had with Taqwa there on the definition of zakat, I wanted to bring in your organisation. So could you tell us about the National Zakat Foundation and its role in the collection and distribution of zakat?
Our organisation started about 14 years ago, and it actually started from stories of homeless Muslim women in Birmingham. The first marketing tagline for the organisation, which I'm aware of, is it went something like, what's the point of 3 million Muslims if Aisha has to sleep on the street? And so actually the origins of National Zakat Foundation is tackling domestic violence. And the most iconic early projects of the organization were shelters for homeless Muslim women. There's about 3 across the country. And then we expanded in stages. There was a shelter for ex-offenders, and the project grew from there. The idea of National Zakat Foundation actually draws from the timeless teachings of our classical legal tradition, Islamic legal tradition, namely that zakat is ideally spent in the very city where a person lives, which was not the practice, and as Taqwa's podcast has shown, has not still been the ongoing practice of what is largely, not exclusively, but largely a diaspora community. So as Taqwa's podcast showed really well, which is zakat in practice is a corollary of a person's own sense of identity, which in the first generation of a diaspora community, identity is tied to another land called back home. And so National Zakat Foundation, drawing on Islamic tradition, not just notions of identity and belonging, has been championing the cause of actually zakat belongs here. These are communities where our wealth is raised. These are communities where our wealth should be spent. So it's been a really long, fascinating, interesting journey in tackling questions of identity, of belonging, of Islamic tradition, in the backdrop of what many people see as, if I can call it, a struggling welfare situation here in the UK. And so we've had, increasing demand, but also increasing income, meaning even though times are getting tougher, there's a greater awareness that money is needed here. And so that's where we're at today. Just to give you a sense of scale, we spend about £7 million within the UK a year. We help about 30,000 people in a year. We specialize in direct cash giving. As far as we're aware, we are the largest movers of direct cash within the UK. So there's some sense of the scale and the origins of the project.
So it's grown a lot then since you started in 2011. Is that representative of a wider trend amongst British Muslims to be donating or distributing their zakat in their own communities in this country as opposed to abroad? Because I know that study that I cited at the beginning showed that I think it was 86% of Muslims were actually sending money abroad as well.
I've been in the role for about 3 years. From my vantage point, there's a shift in importance given to local projects and spending within the UK. There's no doubt about it. But it's coming off the backdrop of a ongoing practice where the majority of money is going overseas. At National Zakat Foundation, we're trying to avoid a conversation of either or a conversation of competition. We are aware that as a British society in general and a British Muslim society, we have privileges, we have advantages people over the world don't have. So by no means is our message that we have no responsibility to global concerns or global worries, but we do need to increase our contributions where we live in line with, again, classical Islamic teachings. So there's no doubt across all sectors, from small givers, major givers. What's really fascinating in my time is even projects that are set up as international relief projects, they are increasingly trying to channel some of their zakat to UK projects. So there's this idea in the wider psyche that whatever is going on across the world, which we are able to support, we need to do more here. So it's a very interesting shift, and I don't think it's going to go back. I think it's only going to increase.
And Taqwa, one thing that I found interesting from your series was this exploration of what zakat actually is. And one observation was that it's not charity. Could you tell me a bit about that?
I think that it comes back to this idea of it being compulsory or obligatory. It's the idea that with charity, we have a sense of this is voluntary giving, this is out of the generosity of someone's heart, and this is a very benevolent act. Whereas with zakat, the idea is slightly different in that there's a sense that you are indebted to people in your community who don't have as much as you if you have surpassed that threshold of wealth. There's an idea that you owe them some of that money, they have a right over that 2.5%. And I think that's where it departs from charity a bit and moves more into a space of social responsibility and how accountable you are to the people that you live amongst. And it makes the most sense when you are talking in this kind of more local neighborhood setting rather than the kind of overwhelming feeling of being responsible for all of the poverty across the world. I think that's not what it's trying to get at. But with diaspora communities, that's where it often ends up leaning towards. But if we go back to the sense of like it's supposed to be for the city or town or village that you live in, then that's where the sort of like element of responsibility and accountability makes sense. It's a lot more manageable and realistic.
Just a small comment. I have a very good friend called Professor Taqwa Sadiq who runs the Department for Muslim Philanthropy. It's the only one I'm aware of in the world out of the University of Indianapolis. And he made a point I've always found so fascinating, which he said philanthropy has been framed in secular terms. And so in the academy, he's trying to give a broader understanding what philanthropy could be. So the common definition is that philanthropy is voluntary giving for the public good. So he always questions, but what if you felt it wasn't voluntary? What if you felt it was your duty, which is this notion of zakat as duty? And also he questions the part when it comes to for the public good, then all giving is for a public good. But what if your driver is for God? Or what if you're driving also for self-refinement, personal improvement, overcoming greed? And so there are larger frames that a faith notion of giving can give that what he would call a purely secular framing can't encompass. And that's part of the challenge that Taqwa started off. How do you situate zakat? I used to be a lecturer on Islamic law in my previous life. I always used to give them, actually it was an end of year exam question. Is zakat tax or is it worship? Because it has features of both. That's what makes it so fascinating.
What role do international NGOs and the wider UK charity sector have to play in the process of collecting and distributing zakat, do you think?
So, first of all, zakat is one of the greatest movements of wealth on the planet, as far as I'm aware. I think World Bank estimates on how much zakat moves across the planet is anywhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion or something annually, because it's an annual payment. And so what that means is that even international non-Muslim agencies are now increasingly trying to tap into the global zakat pool. So in terms of what role international relief charities have, they've been actually the largest historically, traditionally, collectors and movers of zakat, and they continue to be. But what is so fascinating now, if you look at the UK scene, NZF, which is just the abbreviation for National Zakat Foundation, we're the only ones collecting and distributing nationwide. So we have the largest sort of nationwide wallet, if you like, for that. And I said to you earlier, international relief agencies are tapping into that. But beneath us, if you like, on the very local scene, there are movements of zakat that no one actually knows about. People, we call them aunties, ladies in the household sending on WhatsApp, and people giving just hand to hand at the local mosque. I know mosques that have no official zakat pot, yet they have to distribute £20,000 a year. Because people say to the imam, here's my 500, find someone, here's this, find someone, here's this, find someone. And it's sort of just under the table, they're just finding people to distribute funds to. So the real zakat story in the UK, I think, is still a mystery. And what I've also found in the work that we're doing at NZF, we're trying to really decentralize and create a model of real community ownership, where people are really part of a movement within their communities. So we're partnering with mosques and community centers. And what I found in that conversation is, even before our own involvement in that, so many people are trying to coordinate zakat now in very local community settings. I think it's a very exciting development, very keen to contribute to. So you can see there's like a pyramid with your largest international relief with the biggest wallet. We've got ourselves on a national wallet, if I can use that phrase loosely. We've got now growing collectives in communities. And then we just have the real hand-to-hand, under-the-table community giving. All of that is part of UK and global zakat. And we only know, if I could say, the tip of the iceberg, which is, sorry, maybe it's the other way around. We know what's under the iceberg. We know the bigger amount, but there's a lot of movement that I don't think we have full knowledge of as well.
And are you getting approaches from these community groups or perhaps these imams who are getting increasing levels of money to distribute, saying, hey, actually, we feel there is a role for a formalized charity structure such as yourselves?
That is absolutely what we're trying to create, because what happens is which Taqwa's podcast, I think, touched on. There's, in addition to this duty to give and this impetus to give, there's a lot of stigma about touching this money because there's rules. Who is a good recipient? Have you assessed them properly? Is this a recipient? And so there's a lot of fear about handling zakat as well. So what we kind of do in our community engagement is to demystify zakat. Say, no, you can handle zakat, and it's not hard to assess someone. We give them training, we give them systems, we give them technology, we give them ways that we can even give an environment, I call it cashless cash giving on site, where an assessment can happen between you and me. You authorize a payment, and National Zakat Foundation can authorize cash pickup at the local post office, for example. So you don't have to worry about the due diligence matters of handling cash on site. And I get sometimes people that they have a program, they just want consultation. Are their systems good? Are their checks good? So there's just this other part of fear about mishandling, where we're helping with, again, training and systems. But yes, the conversation is just growing, people wanting that support.
What about the broader charity sector, perhaps non-Muslim charities? Are you open to partnership with them? Do you think that they should be encouraged to participate in the system of collecting and distributing zakat, or are there issues surrounding that?
So I can talk maybe what I've been involved in, which is the UK scene. I did hint earlier that the largest international relief agencies are also trying to tap into this. I've not been in conversations with like UN agencies and the like. But on the UK scene, there's a few things that I found really interesting models, which is we've partnered. I always give this example. A few years back, we partnered with, I think it's called C4WS. It's a Christian housing shelter in central London. So we covered the costs of their Muslim residents with zakat money so that their funds could go further. So with the idea that even though it's a pool of fund that's largely moving within the Muslim community, there's no reason why we cannot strategically employ this as a win for everyone in shared projects. And so quite early on, I had quite good conversations. They got advanced, but at the time all parties felt it was maybe the right time to start with Trussell Trust Food Banks and also with British Red Cross as well within the UK about how we could partner with zakat cash distribution on site. That was very interesting as well. And also outside of charity projects, we've been talking to MP offices, local councils, areas where there's a large Muslim population. Like I said, our welfare structures are a little bit, let's say teetering on, struggling.
I'd say completely messed up.
Thank you. I was just not sure how to say it. We've got local councils just on the verge of bankruptcy. And so and MP offices with people coming and not knowing where to direct them to. And so we've had quite good conversations there where they can actually direct people to us. And we're hoping in the long term, direct some funds where we could step up to be able to offer that network of support. We released a report that showed that £1 we spend to secure people in shelter saves the public wallet £73. It's just the sense that early intervention is so powerful. So anyway, so in my scene, what I'm trying to hint at is whether it's local government, whether it's even Christian charities, just on the level of program collaboration, there's lots of scope, lots of room, lots of interest, but just limited capacity and resources. But if we could speak well with each other, share resources wisely, I think there's a winning and necessary formula here. That's just my sense of global collaboration and cooperation in this space. But again, global meaning in the broader space within the UK. Those are the conversations that I've personally been involved in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Taqwa, I'd like to come back to you now and to one of the themes that we have touched upon already, but that was covered quite beautifully in your series, Sacred Money. And it's around that sense of belonging and how your sense of belonging to a particular place or a particular community can influence whether or not you give your zakat money to a certain area, a certain cause, or a certain place in the world. And I'd like to play a brief clip from episode 3 of Sacred Money. And it's from a discussion that you had with Maria Idrissi, who's a famous British hijabi model. And she was born in London, but has a Moroccan father and a Pakistani mother. And I thought it was really interesting, this clip, hearing how she decides where her zakat is going to go to.
We normally we try to give it to who we know needs it most. Maybe it's family in Morocco, like in village community, more rural areas, or my mum's friend in Yemen.
Okay, so this is kind of like the heart of our program, actually. And
I asked Maria about whether she would ever give zakat to UK causes.
With the zakat, being in this country, yes, there are people in need, but I guess back home it's a little bit different. But then also because we're not, native to this country, back home is still our home. You're tied to two communities, essentially. You're tied to the community that you currently live in, but you're also tied to the community that is really yours.
So you're saying that when it comes time to give your zakat, you feel like the support is needed more in those places which you would say are like back home?
For me, yes. The mentality for people like us who come from like other countries in the world and we witness, I guess, a different type of hardship. You shouldn't compare anything, but you know what I mean? We just look at it as like, okay, these people really need help, but these people kind of need help. So it's like, I'm going to go with the one that really need it.
So that was one short clip from the third episode of your series, Taqwa. And I thought it was really interesting because you're discussing the level of need in this country and in countries where certainly younger Muslims, parents, grandparents will have come from. And Sohail, you have already articulated the scale of need in this country with the highly stressed welfare state and the need to kind of plug that gap. But Taqwa, how does a sense of belonging of a young British Muslim like Maria living in London, how does that influence where she's deciding to give her money to? It's almost like there's a bit of a kind of push and pull going on in her mind about who she feels is almost like most in need of this small percentage of her savings that she gives every year.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because I was really surprised when I started to do research for this and interview different types of people to see how much emotion there was associated with this decision. There's a lot of talk about assessing need and thinking about the impact of the amount, but when you actually rationalize it, I think you realize how much of that is actually just coming from a place of emotion. So like you picked up on, it's a very small amount that she's talking about. Zakat is only 2.5% of your savings, of money that you don't need. It's after you've deducted, what you need for your bills and your mortgage and things like that. It's, for many young people, it's quite a small amount that you end up giving. And then the question becomes, well, how far can maybe £100 or £200 go? For many people, quite a small amount. And so once you start to then get into the conversation around impact and where it should go and where it can make more impact, I think a lot of people think about the value of the British pound abroad and how £100, if you sent it to somewhere, I don't know, let's say if Maria were to spend that in Morocco, that would go much further in theory than it would in the UK. So that's one kind of layer to it. Another thing is this idea of belonging, as you picked up on, and I think a lot of people who have never been to the countries that their grandparents might be from, this is sort of a way to maintain that tradition, maintain that tie, and they don't want to let go of that, but they are also increasingly becoming aware of, and I think like organizations like National Zakat Foundation and various other campaigns, there's a growing awareness amongst Muslims my own age of what zakat is actually supposed to be for and the levels of poverty in Britain. I think poverty here is still very much hidden. I was taken aback to see what people are actually living through in my own area, and I would only know about that because I went out as a journalist and did that kind of research. If it wasn't for me actively looking for it, I wouldn't know that that poverty exists. And I think the welfare state, it's really, once you're in this conversation, it's really easy to say, oh yeah, it's crumbling and it's struggling and it's under a lot of strain. But unless you're engaging with the charity sector a little bit and engaging with like local government, you're not going to actually know that. There's still a lot of rhetoric around people who don't need them receiving benefits and people just sort of living off of the state. And it creates a culture where you do think there is a safety net in the UK. and abroad there isn't necessarily a welfare state. So I think all of these kind of, on the surface, they seem like rational reasons for giving abroad rather than giving in the UK, but a lot of them are based off of narratives that are circulating, but they're no longer actually accurate. And I think the cost of living crisis has really brought that into sharp relief, and people are now understanding that more. So I think someone like Maria, by the end of our conversation, she was seriously reconsidering giving her zakat in the UK versus giving it abroad. But every year that somebody like her has to give it, all of these different questions are going to come up, and she's going to have to make like a very personal choice every single time.
Sohail, I just wanted to build on what Taqwa was saying through the lens of your charity. So could you just tell me, how is the NZF strengthening the sense of community in your initiatives? Is there anything in particular that you're doing?
So first of all, when we spoke about the sense of scale, so we try to cover the whole country, both in the raising of funds and in the distribution of support. So we've developed ways to allow funds to reach people really online. Some people say, where's your office? I say, our office is in the cloud. We kind of rain down money on people. That's just using the advantage of technology. So we can support people through post office cash, through bank transfer, through paying their landlords and local governments on their behalf, and so on. In that sense, it's remote. But we always ask recipients, did this increase your faith? Because it's like a faith-led relationship. Does it make you feel closer to your community? And overwhelmingly, people always answer yes. So even when they didn't meet anyone, the fact that they could apply for support and they know that the community was there for them, they feel connected. That's at the level of just our national programs. What we're trying to do increasingly, and we're just trying to accelerate this now, is what I hinted at earlier, which was really sort of decentralizing our management so that really communities can feel it's their project. And we are supporting them with training and systems and oversight, but really it's their project to support their own communities. And our findings on this have been excellent. A lot of our work has been with mosques, but not exclusively. And mosques, it's another corollary. If there were a part two to this conversation, it's just the role of faith centers like mosques. They start up as prayer spaces, but then they have classes, and then they start having to have welfare projects. So just the growth of faith spaces, which are turning into community hubs of many needs. We found that people were coming for the small cash who weren't coming for the food bank or the other services. But then there would be like a zakat needs some sort of assessment or conversation. Although Taqwa gave the example where some people don't do that. But there's sort of an assessment conversation of sorts. And that conversation was like therapeutic for people to have someone to talk to about their needs. The mosque got to know more about needs of people because of this, again, brief assessment conversation. The mosque was able to signpost them to food bank and other services the mosque had. People started being part of the mosque community. Some of the people who came for support started volunteering to help others at the mosque. We then had the mosque. The first mosque we started with is the Al Madina Mosque in Barking. It's also a community hub for the Barking and Dagenham Council. So they were able to signpost people to the council for council support. The mosque was then able to go to other surrounding mosques to say, we have this zakat program if you want to send people over. They started sharing counseling services. So the idea was, if you just allow people to sort of own this giving of support on site, it leads not just to recipients connecting to the mosque, but then people connecting to other people, and then mosques connecting to mosques, mosques connecting to local councils. This idea of grassroots, community-led giving, again, I think that is the trend across society, and it needs to be. Because if there's a silver lining almost, however we want to look at it, of the weakening of our public structures, it's allowing us to go back to how people have been, which is community solidarity. And I think what I hope NZF can be, although we're in the space of, an ancient faith tradition with ancient rules, what I hope we can be is a leader in a model of community-led giving. And I hope we can collaborate across communities, because I think communities can and should fill this gap. And I think it's something we need as modern societies. What are other concerns we have outside of welfare? We talk about alienation, loneliness, and all these other concerns. I think community giving, community activism, community-led welfare and solidarity, I think it's a need on many registers, and I do hope NZF can be a leader and collaborator in this space.
I'm sure what you've just said will ring true with a lot of our listeners who are from the UK charity sector. As you say, the importance of local community-led initiatives should definitely not be underestimated. Just wondered, as a parting question, practically speaking, when you're in the process of decentralizing and supporting these interpersonal initiatives at the grassroots level, how can charities practically do that? If you sort of had one tip for somebody running a charity in terms of how they can best support these small-scale local initiatives, what would it be?
Well, first of all, I would still say, before I give any tips, we're at the beginning. We are learning. We're learning through doing. Very, very open if people have better models to reach out and inform as well. Just on our side, because we've at this stage prioritized cash giving, and we've gone into our grassroots work after really spending a lot of time on what I call our cloud-based remote work, what we've developed is, I think, a reasonably good technological infrastructure. So I think for us, technology has been very helpful, because even on the community level, what it means is the assessor in a mosque has a system where they are logging IDs, logging their data in a conversation. They then have a second level approver in the mosque who will check that and authorize a payment. And then we will have just a third level quick check, and then we'll either reimburse or do the payment. So it gives everyone trust that we don't, again, the way we do it, we never give lump sums to the mosque. The mosque is not a recipient of cash from us. We are dealing directly with the recipient through these. Currently, it's volunteer-led. Again, that's what we have to think in the future. Can this continue being volunteer-led? Because we're working with volunteer-led projects. So the idea is people want to serve in their communities. They want to do surgeries. So it's not like 24/7, you have to be present. And they have the comfort that we're giving them technology, we're giving them training, we're giving oversight, and we are tracking all this movement. We can give them reports. We can say, oh, in this month, you helped this many people. They came from these postcodes. These are trends. So if there's anything I can say, because it's what we invested in before we started, although my own interest, I never talk the language of technology. I talk about people and movements and grassroots and education, and I talk about the human very much. The fact that we've invested so much in systems, it allows humans to feel supported. So that's just something that we found really helpful.
Brilliant. Well, Taqwa, Sohail, thank you both so much for joining us. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear you speak, and I would recommend that everybody listen to Sacred Money on BBC Sounds if you haven't already. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Taqwa and Sohail, and that's it for this week. If you'd like to give us any feedback or have a topic you'd like us to cover in future, there are 2 easy ways of getting in touch. You can either complete our short anonymous podcast listener survey or send me an email. You can find details of both in the show notes to this episode. Thank you for listening. Our producer this week is Till Owen.